Time to talk about pests. George Hamilton showed you how to identify some of the pests, insects in the home garden, and I'll touch on a couple that he already talked about. Also, I had a professor at Cook one time that told us all that variety is the spice of life and repetition is the bread and butter. So Andy already presented this IPM definition. You should have already had it in class. This should be repetition by now as master gardeners, that we're using all our tools possible when we're looking to manage and control the pests and keep them at acceptable levels, whether it be acceptable to you or your client. As Andy was asking for hands of fungicide applicators, there weren't many. Many of your clients don't want to apply a fungicide, but some will, or an insecticide, and so we'll talk about those tools within our IPM type of practices. Andy talked about resistant varieties, and that really probably applies more readily to under cultural methods to diseases, but there's one or two occasions where we might choose a variety for insect resistance. We're always looking at plants. We're always having our hand lenses, our magnifying glasses out there, looking closely at plants, looking at growing tips, looking underside of leaves, identifying problems early on so that we can get them under control before they cause big problems. Crop rotation, again, is probably more important for disease, but some insects overwinter in the soil. They may lay eggs in the soil, so we want to practice as good a crop rotation if we can. Andy touched on sanitation. Again, composting, some of these things, getting it up out of the garden, composting with a hot pile, not to let it rot like Andy's dad does, and I do too. So if it's really infested, get it up and out, and don't go the compost route, or don't put that compost back in your vegetable garden. And then Andy talked about watering, other fertilization practices. Of course, we're encouraging soil testing. We're all testing our own soils, knowing what nutrients are in there and what we need to add, adding the proper amounts. Over-fertilizing can encourage certain insects like aphids, so we don't want to do that. Under-fertilizing makes the plant not grow very fast. What I typically find in most vegetable gardens with soil tests, if you've looked at any at the office or your own, they typically have plenty of fertilizer. That is not the problem. They're probably dying from a disease or insect that is going unidentified. So hopefully this will help you today and your clients identify those problems and look for controls. I'll talk on specific insects, on some other mechanical controls, collars and screens, mulches, and then if you're not too squeamish, there's always your fingers and toes if you identify them early on as a mechanical means. With all these things, we're always, and George touched on this a little bit, we're always encouraging the good insects in the garden. There's biological control going on in your home vegetable garden, whether you know it or not. We want to encourage and promote that throughout. But George showed you a few beneficials. We all know ladybird beetles eating aphids there. We might also be familiar with praying mantises. I got here a little late. I don't know if he talked about those. But they can be good in that they eat other insects. However, they will also eat each other. They'll eat ladybird beetles, so they're not a real good specific predator. If they're in the garden, they're nice to look at. They're fun to watch. I wouldn't kill them or anything, but I wouldn't buy praying mantis egg cases if I was going to buy a beneficial in any case. But I tend not to buy beneficials and encourage gardeners to try and plant flowers around the vegetable garden to attract beneficials. And this is a long list, and you can look online and get some lists and get specific plants that attract specific beneficials to your garden. The beneficial insects typically need protein from eating other insects. They also are attracted to nectar meals from these specific flowers. In this case, I highlighted in red 3 different beneficial or flowers that attract beneficials that Dr. Hamilton, who you met earlier, had a study going with a graduate student to look at which flowers attracted certain beneficials to control pepper pests. And those, he had the grad student netting all the insects that went to the flowers, be it beneficial or not, and then bringing them back to the lab and identifying all of them for hours and hours. That's why we have grad students, to find out these interesting things. So then they planted at our research farm in Pittstown plots of peppers on one side of the farm and plots of peppers on the other side of the farm. And one plot had flowers next to it to attract the beneficials, and the other did not. And this row of dill and coriander or cilantro gone to seed was just buzzing with all kinds of beneficial insects. He mentioned the hoverfly there, ladybird beetles. And so it was bringing them in, attracting them. And then through the research, they found they were flying over to the pepper plants, eating the eggs of the insects, and providing a significant measure of control compared to the plot that did not have flowers. So plant your flowers, attract your beneficials. That's going to help control the pests and reduce their population. So that's biological, and we'll talk about some other examples of that. We will mention throughout, I'll have chemical controls on there. Andy talked about the pre-harvest interval. We're always, with any pesticide, stopping and reading the label, particularly if it's something we're going to apply to something we're going to eat, and we're going to wait the pre-harvest interval depending on the product. These are the two fact sheet numbers. I believe the 23 is the list of insecticides, both synthetic and organic, that we recommend for the different vegetable pests, and I believe 24 is the fungicides. I could have them reversed, but those are the two that you want to take advantage of. And really, we'll have a lot of the information that I'm putting up here, so you don't have to take tons of notes of the chemical names. You don't have to take all those down. You can avail yourself of those fact sheets. I'll start with a few pests that get into multiple vegetables, and then we'll get into some pests that are more specific to certain crops. Nick was looking at my picture earlier and laughing at this. I told him, what's wrong? What, you don't like my tomato plant? This is a few years ago in my garden. I planted a transplant out, and that's what I woke up to the next morning. It had been chopped off here and here. The culprit wasn't a deer. It was a cutworm, the larva of a moth that flies around and lays its eggs around plants, and the larva crawls around at nighttime, typically, or in cloudy days, and finds your tomato plants and chews on them. We see a lot of cutworms when we first convert a garden, a weedy area, to a vegetable garden, or if we have a lot of weeds next door. So they're attracted to those weedy areas, just another reason to control weeds. A couple things you can do to control cutworms. If you've ever seen older gardeners putting collars around the base of the tomato plants and wondered why, that is to control cutworms. The idea here is a thick collar or a can with two ends cut out provides a mechanical means of keeping the cutworm from chewing on the young tomato plant. They seem to be attracted to young succulent plants. When the plant gets bigger, they're not really chewing on them, but young seedlings, different vegetables like tomatoes, they'll go after. So that collar gives you a couple weeks for the plant to harden off and no longer be attractive to the cutworm. An interesting biological or organic means to control cutworms are beneficial nematodes. Nematodes are microscopic worms that live in the soil, and there are both pest nematodes that cause problems for plants, and there's also beneficial nematodes that move around in the soil and look for soil-borne insects, and they actually get inside of things like grubs and cutworms, and they feed on the inside of the insect, and those are millions of beneficial nematodes hatching out of the dead grub. So in this case, researchers have identified these things, and there's been a lot of research going on at Rutgers with beneficial nematodes. They've identified species, they've been able to reproduce them in the lab and create a resting stage that they then can ship to farmers and gardeners, and you can apply them. Usually it looks like a little sponge you put in a watering can and you douse the plant or area that you're trying to protect from the pest. The challenge with that is it's a living organism, so it has a shorter shelf life than a bottle of chlorothalonil. You have to keep them cool and not overheat them, or too cold and not freeze them. And so typically you're talking priority shipping type of thing, quickly and applying them. And you do need to know what species of nematode controls what specific insect you're trying to control. So you'll see sometimes they're promoted as kind of a miracle cure to get all the insects, but they're really only soil-borne insects, and you need to know which to apply them to. I'm not going to read all through all these, again, synthetic materials, carbaryls and older material still available can be applied, but usually the collars and the nematodes would be another means. And again, I've listed the fact sheets on here, so if you have a specific problem or pest, or a client does, those fact sheets talk a little bit more in detail and depth about the life cycle, so you can really know your enemy in the vegetable garden. George mentioned aphids and the problems with aphids reproducing very quickly. They're tiny sucking insect pests, suck the juices and sap from the plant. And the problem with aphids is they, while they're small, and so they don't, each individual doesn't do a whole lot of damage. As he said, they reproduce very rapidly. Some of them produce only females, and so one aphid doesn't usually stay one aphid very long. They like the underside of leaves, they like the growing tips. And so again, that's why we're out there inspecting when we can find 1 or 2 aphids instead of 200 or 300. Some of the control measures that you can implement with aphids, a forceful stream of water works well. So if you discovered your eggplant had aphids on it, you could take it to a faucet, hose it off vigorously to knock the aphids off. They're very small and soft-bodied, so that'll damage a lot of them and wash them off. And then do that a couple times, put it back someplace where the aphids didn't fall off of the plant. And hopefully you've knocked back the population so that the beneficial insects can then take care of it. I've seen outbreaks of aphids, and then we had a heavy storm, and that pretty much stopped the infestation. And again, ladybird beetles and things come in afterwards. But sometimes in certain situations, they get ahead of the problem and you get a large population. An interesting control for aphids that's been applied in commercial means in studies has shown to work is foil mulch. It's like a mylar type material that's used to mulch, laid down on the soil and mulched, in this case, globe artichokes. And the reflection off the soil repels the aphids, and so they never really want to land on the plant. Whether they think the sky is up or the light, it's really hard to interview an aphid, so it's hard to tell. I'll mention a couple organic materials. Insecticidal soap is natural fatty acids that erodes the external skeleton or skin of an aphid and causes them to desiccate, so it can be applied to plants and forms an organic insecticide. A lot of people talk about home remedies, home formulas or recipes of soaps. We kind of discourage that. Some of those materials might work, some of those materials might not work. Some of those materials might contain other additives that might damage the plant. In the case of insecticidal soap, it's got a label, it's been tested on plants, and we know it works. Again, just like the insect, some soaps will take off the waxy coating of the insect. It could also take the waxy coating off a leaf. So while it tends to be more expensive, we recommend folks stick with the labeled insecticide material, which will have warnings, things like don't apply it to ferns, I think is one of the warnings on the label. Azadirachtin is a botanical material, botanical insecticide. I've seen a lot of literature claiming it does a lot of different things, but in this case, it does have some efficacy in killing and repelling aphids, so we recommend it for that. George showed pictures of whiteflies, another tiny sucking insect that gets on tomatoes and several other vegetables. Sometimes I've seen it in community gardens on cole crops. Again, 1 or 2 are not a big deal, but they usually don't stay 1 or 2 for very long. As George mentioned, we want to encourage those beneficials because he lost his pepper crop because the beneficials couldn't catch up. So again, we want to identify it early, attract those beneficials, and hopefully keep them in check. And he's, as he mentioned, they are a pest in greenhouses, so they don't overwinter outdoors. They like that warmer weather, so that's where they start and sometimes overwinter in the greenhouse. One of the mechanical means that a lot of organic growers try and utilize in certain situations to keep and screen pests out are floating row covers. Floating row covers are a cloth-like material that allows air, water, and light through, but does not allow insects through. There are different types of floating row covers, different thicknesses. For insect control, we're using a very thin material that allows all that air, water, and light through. Some of the thick materials are also used for frost control, and they do typically warm the soil underneath. which is fine for things like we have eggplant here growing. And with floating, typically with certain crops that have the growing tip at the bottom, like lettuce or carrots, we can just allow that material to float over the top, and then we do have to anchor it with sandbags or other means, or even just cover it with soil to keep it down. So again, it creates that screen and protects the crop. With crops like eggplant or tomatoes, they have the growing tip at the top. When the row cover blows in the wind, it can abrade the growing tip. So typically with those type of crops, we have some kind of support to keep it off the crop. This was a trial we were looking at organic control, and we'll talk about flea beetles later of eggplant. And it was kind of a failure on both measures, that there wasn't a really bad flea beetle year, so we never got flea beetles to control. And also they went out and they had a couple aphids on the plants before they went under the row cover. So you cover a plant with row cover and there's aphids inside. The predators can't touch the aphids. And so it's hard to see here, but those are all curled up with lots of aphids. So that's the challenge of using this as a mechanical control. You need to make sure you have clean plants underneath. Two other materials I'll mention briefly for whitefly control. Pyrethrum are a botanical insecticide made of a daisy-like flower, which is considered organic. The issue with pyrethrum is that it breaks down very rapidly in UV light, and so you spray it, and within a couple hours the compound breaks down and it's no longer working. So researchers discovered this, scientists, and they made a synthetic form, pyrethrins, which lasts a little bit longer in the environment. The challenge with both of these materials is they're very tough on beneficial insects. So if you spray a lot of pyrethrins, you kill the aphids, but you also kill all the beneficials or whitefly, and then you have oftentimes you'll get a reflush of the pest. Sometimes when researchers are trying to study whitefly or aphids, they'll spray pyrethrins multiple times, kill all the beneficials, and then watch as the aphids take off, and then they can spray their chemical to control the aphids. So you really want to be careful, whether it's organic or synthetic, of applying a lot of pyrethrins. Another pest that gets on lots of different vegetables, as well as flowers, are slugs and snails. Oftentimes we may not see, in a nice sunny day, we don't see the pest itself, but we see the cutting damage here on peppers. Comes in all kinds of shapes and sizes and colors, but they all come out at night in rainy days, shred our plants, and then leave their silvery slime trail. And gardeners have come up with all kinds of means to seek their revenge on the slugs, one of which are traps. You can fill plastic containers with beer and bury them at soil level, and the slugs are attracted to the beer and they fall in and drown, and now you have a nice stale beer slug concoction to dispose of. Some people use things like pieces of wood to get the slugs or snails to go under there during the day and then bring them to their bird feeder or drive them over with a car, whatever they want to do. Because I don't know, does anybody really like slugs? Another interesting control mechanical means is copper. Slugs and snails don't like to crawl across copper. I'm not exactly sure of the mechanism, but they won't go across it. So I've ordered this from a mail order supply company because I needed to have this to show you folks. Is a collar made out of copper that you can put a ring around plants and protect them. The challenge with that is copper is pretty expensive, so you may not have it the next day if your neighbor sees all the copper in your garden. But it does work, supposedly. Diatomaceous earth is a powder-like material made from diatoms, and when they die, they leave this skeleton-like material, very coarse. So if you look under a microscope of that powder, it's very sharp, and the snails and slugs don't like to crawl across it, so you can sprinkle that material around plants and they won't get in there. Has to be reapplied with the rain, and you might want to read the label carefully and be a little bit careful about breathing in that material, because I don't think you want that sharp material dust in your lungs. It's also sold for pool filters, and from what I've read and understand, it's heat treated in a way for pool filters that you wouldn't be as effective as a insecticide or slugicide. Again, another one where it's a lot cheaper than the slugicide formulation, but I don't think it supposedly doesn't work as well in the pool filter form. A newer material out that's considered organic is iron phosphate bait, a material that's designed to attract slugs in. They eat it and supposedly they die. I've read studies out of Oregon where they have foot-long banana slugs, and it seems to work there. So I would expect it to work on our less robust slugs here in New Jersey. Not an insect, but another tiny pest that gets on several different vegetables are spider mites. Tiny sucking pests. When the populations get high, you can get actually webbing between the leaves. It is very small, so it is one where you do want to have the hand lens to look at it and identify it. But typically, when I see this on a leaf, what we call stippling, this kind of grayish, whitish look to it, I'm typically turning the leaf over with a hand lens, and typically what I'm finding is spider mites are there, or they possibly sometimes were there. They tend to build up in hot, dry conditions, so if we have a droughty year, you'll see spider mite outbreaks. Like aphids, a forceful stream of water will wash them off, and if we're in a very drought condition, this is the one time where we do kind of wetting the leaves is okay. We got to be careful about that for fungal reasons, but for spider mites, a little bit of extra humidity will make it less favorable environment. Insecticidal soap works on them, as well as several types of both organic and synthetic oils. Okay, moving on to some more crop-specific pests. Those are some of the ones that get onto multiple crops. These are pests that are more crop-specific. George showed you, well, what I believe he had was a tobacco hornworm. This is actually a tomato hornworm. They look very similar. The tomato hornworm has a V-shaped stripe on it. They both have a horn, big, long, they grow to be very big, long, 4-inch long caterpillars, the larva of a moth. This is what I believe is the tobacco hornworm with only one white stripe on it. I tend to see more tobacco hornworms in New Jersey than I do tomato hornworms. Both do the similar damage. The moth lays its eggs on the tomato plants, and they chew the fruit. This is one where if you're not too squeamish, you can hand pick them off. They tend to be the same color of a tomato plant. They tend to hide on the underside of leaves, so sometimes they're hard to find. Sometimes I follow the chewing damage. Sometimes I follow their very large frass excrement from chewing your tomato plant. The good news is George mentioned is there's a natural predator wasp out there laying its eggs on the tomato hornworm. The wasp lays its eggs, the eggs hatch, burrow into the tomato hornworm, eat it from the inside out, and these are the cocoons of the wasp ready to hatch out and control other tomato worms. So often when gardeners find that, they don't get rid of that worm, they might take it off the tomato plant, but as you can see, it's curled up, it's got a pretty bad stomach ache at this point, so it's not feeding much anymore. And so those worms are going to go out, and that's what keeps the tomato hornworm population in check. So usually we don't see a ton of those. Bacillus thuringiensis is a natural bacteria, a stomach toxin to caterpillars that has been replicated in the lab, can be sprayed on crops, and will kill caterpillars. So it's pretty effective against tomato hornworm. The caution, I would say, with Bacillus thuringiensis, and again, we're always reading the label and thinking about these things, Bacillus thuringiensis is very effective on pretty much all caterpillars. So it's a stomach toxin to caterpillars which have an alkaline stomach, so it's not effective, it's not harmful to humans because it's affecting an alkaline stomach versus an acid stomach. But if you spray it on your milkweed, it's going to control monarch butterfly larvae. If you spray it on parsley, and this is where the IPM and acceptable levels come in, it will control the parsley worm or celery worm, which is also the larva of the black swallowtail moth, so butterfly. So people argue whether you should control that or not. It will defoliate your parsley and celery pretty quick, but it also matures into a nice butterfly. So another new interesting material is called spinosad. It was It's the fermentation product of a natural bacteria that was found in an old rum distillery in the Caribbean. So I think that's why Bonide calls it Captain Jack's Dead Bug Brew. But it's very effective. A lot of organic growers are utilizing this material. It's very effective against caterpillars. And so it's gotten a lot more use. Conventional growers use it as well. So it's a very effective organic pesticide that's got pretty low toxicity to humans and other organisms. Peppers, quickly go over one pest that I don't see as much in North Jersey, a little bit more in South. Sometimes you buy a pepper and you see this little dust here, sawdust-like material, the frass, and you cut it open and you find you have a friend. That is the larva of either a European corn borer or corn earworm. This is the pest that George was trying to control with that study with the beneficial, the flowers to attract beneficials so that they would go over there and eat the eggs and larvae of this pest before it got inside the fruit. So as mentioned here, attracting beneficials is one way to help keep it under control. All the other materials, you've got to apply it early on in the season before that worm gets inside or that it's got a nice protected area to feed on your pepper. Colorado potato beetle likes potatoes. It also really likes eggplant. And this is some of the larvae and can be a very devastating pest, can defoliate a field of eggplant and potatoes in several days. He showed you the adult. There's the eggs, and there's those larvae, those feeding machines. The adult comes out of the soil after the winter, crawls up onto the plant and lays its eggs. One of the other big issues is that it's one insect that's an example of one that's become resistant to many pesticides. So there are certain materials that you can spray on Colorado potato beetles now. It will laugh and keep feeding. And we work a tremendous amount with growers to try and avoid that happening, try and avoid resistance and try and keep materials still effective by not over-applying, using a more of an IPM approach. So one of those IPM approaches is to handpick them off, handpick those eggs off early in the season before the first generation gets going. It is one pest where heavy straw mulch has been shown to be effective. So we're not sure if it causes the adults to have a fungus or something or stay too moist in the soil, or if they get tangled up in it and can't find their way out and get up onto the plant. So a heavy straw mulch when you're growing potatoes can sometimes help. This is one example where, again, they overwinter in the soil, so you wouldn't want to plant potatoes back in the same spot where they could readily get on your crawl right back out. You move them over and possibly put a floating row cover to keep them from getting over the next section where you've planted your potatoes or eggplant. Similar to BT, there's a separate strain of BT tenebrianus that works on very small larvae of the Colorado potato beetle. And then some of these other materials, again, depending on your local population, they may or may not be resistant to something like carbaryl, which has been around for years. Flea beetles are a challenging pest to control in the home garden and for organic growers. Tiny beetle that chews holes in the leaves. Sometimes you see just the holes, sometimes the beetles jump away. It is one that overwinters in the woods in protected locations and does not like really cold winters without much snow cover. So we didn't really have a super cold one, so I'm expecting, and I've heard some reports of a fair amount of flea beetles out there. They do get on, one species gets on eggplant pretty badly, and other species gets on cucurbits. Floating row covers, again, we showed you that attempt to keep them out, although we let the aphids in. Spinosad, I have a question mark. There have been some trials where saying it's somewhat effective, so the jury's still out on that, but it might be something to try. I know a lot of gardeners are always struggling with flea beetles and organic farmers as well. I'll just mention this one material here, hot pepper wax, which is capsaicin, the material that makes hot peppers hot. The material sold in the stores does not have an organic label. I think they have an additive to help it stick to the leaves, and which is synthetic, which means they don't consider it organic, even though it's pretty much mostly the material made from hot peppers. It's not, if you're a purist organic gardener, you can't use that material. Crucifers, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, cauliflower, all get a similar pest, main pest problem we'll encounter in the home garden. Choose these holes, and there it is, the larva of a butterfly. And there's another one. There's the little sulfur-colored butterfly starting to fly. I think I saw one the other day. Attractive little sulfur yellowish butterfly that's flying around, laying its eggs on your cabbage plants. Those eggs hatch out into tiny larvae that go ahead and feed and get bigger to about 1 inch long. You can hand pick them off if you can find them. They are the same color as the cabbage plant, and they will also get up into the heads of broccoli and cabbage. And sometimes you find them at the end of the season when you cook the cabbage. Luckily, BT and spinosad work very well on them. Knowing life cycles is important with insects, and so sometimes we have plants that we have plenty of moisture and suddenly it starts to wilt and die. With the cold crops, if we dig it up, we look at the roots and we see there are maggots chewing on the roofs. That is cabbage maggot, and one of the big things about control is that only flies in the spring. I need a new picture of this. And I'm feeling like Rich Buckley, where I went out and one of my cabbage plants was starting to wilt the other day, and I got all excited and dug it up, but I couldn't find any maggots. So I was so happy my plant was dying, but I didn't get a good picture. So that's somebody else's old picture. So knowing the life cycle, if we plant fall cold crops, we don't have to deal with this insect. Floating row covers can work. Also, they make these protective collars that I had to buy for a picture. The idea here is the fly lays its eggs around the base and it can't get through to go down and feed on the roots. Cucurbits, cucumbers, winter squash, and same family get similar pests, but zucchini is the common one people grow, and the common problem they encounter is this. There's plenty of moisture in the soil and suddenly their plant starts to wilt and die. If they go closer to the base and look around, they'll see this sawdust and holes. And if they cut it open, they'll find out why. And that's the squash vine borer, the larva of a clearwing moth, which kind of looks more like a wasp or something, but has this orange color, flies around, lays its eggs at the base. Before I talk about control, I do want to mention one thing about cucurbits is they are insect pollinated. And so this is a female yellow zucchini flower, and this is a male yellow zucchini flower. Insects need to move the pollen from the male flower to the female in order typically to get fruit. So if we're going to implement something like floating row covers, typically we are removing that at flowering. So it will protect the crop early on, but then once we have flowers, we need insects in there to pollinate. The other idea is to make several plantings of zucchini. Our fact sheet, I was just checking it the other day, I believe it still says July 1st. Is when the last one flies. Apparently the squash vine borer doesn't read our fact sheet. I've had them fly well past July 1st. And this was a demonstration in the Morristown Community Garden. And we protected the crop underneath the floating row cover. All of the plants outside the floating row cover died. And we replanted, I think, August 17th, and they got squash vine borer. So I'm not sure when it stops flying in our area. Some gardeners are able to catch that problem early on and hand destroy the squash vine borer, cut open the stem, find it, and kill it, and then mound up the soil again and get it to reroot. I typically don't find it early enough to do that. I've never had success. Once the squash vine borer is in the stem, you can spray the outside all you want, but the insect is not going to eat or be in contact with the insecticide. So since it's the larva it's a caterpillar, some gardeners actually inject the stem they have a syringe and use Bacillus thuringiensis and inject it so that the squash vine borer comes in contact. I will mention briefly in this project, we actually grew what's called a parthenocarpic variety of squash. So parthenocarpic varieties, and there's only 1 or 2 that I've seen on squash, do not require insect pollination in order to form fruit. So we were able to use the row cover all season long and got squash out of that for the food pantry, while the stuff outside completely died from squash vine borer. A similar problem we were also looking at in that project was cucumber beetles. tiny beetle pests that chews on cucumbers, which does damage in large populations, can kill seedlings. But also what's bad about it is in its stomach lives bacterial wilt. And so it'll transmit bacterial wilt from weeds into your cucumber and cause the plant to wilt and die. Typically we see the striped form in New Jersey. There's also a spotted form. Again, we can keep them out with floating row covers, removed at flowering, but there are also parthenocarpic types of cucumbers. Actually, there's more varieties of parthenocarpic cucumbers than squash developed for greenhouse production. As far as resistance, the beetles are attracted to by cucurbitacin, and so there are some varieties that have less cucurbitacin that you can try and look at. Some of the burpless types of cucumbers might be less attractive to cucumber beetles and less affected by the bacterial wilt. Mexican bean beetle is a pest, looks like a ladyberry beetle, but is chewing on your beans. I mentioned this one because it has been pushed, the population has been knocked back by the Department of Agriculture releasing a predator wasp. They raise it in a lab in Trenton and release it here to knock back the population. And so if you see a population, I've worked with them, or I've had community gardens call them, and they've done releases of that predator to knock the Mexican bean beetle population back. Corn is a challenge to grow in the home garden, height-wise, shades out other things, requires a lot of nitrogen, and has 3 primary worm pests, moths that fly in, lay their eggs on the corn, the eggs hatch and the larvae burrow in, and then you've got wormy corn. The populations tend to build over the summer, move on storms, and so the earlier we can plant and get the corn in and out, the better. There has been some research with a couple drops of vegetable oil on the silk. It helps to control the worms. One researcher combined that with BT and has provided control. That's something that's probably more practical on a home garden scale than is on a commercial scale, where putting a couple drops of oil on 10 acres of sweet corn is highly labor intensive. And finish up with one, spinach gets a pest. A fly that comes in, lays its eggs on the spinach, typically on the underside of leaves. The leaf miner, the larvae hatch and burrow through the 2 cell layers. They're so small. And keeping them out with floating row covers is probably a really good means, but also the new material, spinosad, is effective against spinach leaf miner. And hopefully with Andy's and mine advice, you end up with a truck full of produce at the end of this growing season.